Stephanie Carroll has been an outspoken and effective advocate for workers for many years. She is the daughter of a former nuclear worker. She is the founder of Atomic Worker Advocacy, Inc. Stephanie Carroll has extensive experience and expertise in preparing claims on behalf of former Rocky Flats workers. Her work is critical to our understanding the plight of government workers at nuclear facilities and how government can mislead, redirect, and deny the existence of environmental hazards.
Hello, I'm honored to be speaking with you today on behalf of PSR Colorado on how the work of an authorized representative under the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act led to CDC NIOSH admitting that they cannot characterize the radiation environment at Rocky Flats. In 2013, they admitted that they cannot reconstruct radiation dose in regards to uranium-233, neptunium-237, and thorium. It is not just plutonium that is a concern at the site, but many other products that are rarely acknowledged. In 2000, the program to compensate nuclear workers for cancer and other illnesses related to their exposures was passed under the weight of multiple class action lawsuits and activism from workers, downwinders, and US citizens. Congress had to answer to the human and environmental cost of developing the nuclear stockpile. In this case, workers found to be suffering from illnesses related to their toxic exposure at these sites are provided compensation and medical benefits for their covered illness. I have the honor to help them navigate a system that, though meant to be a form of restitution and apology to the workers, has become quite adversarial. I am their authorized representative. Here's my story. In 1982, I was 17 when my grandfather became a plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against the Department of Energy. We were very close. I was curious about the multiple trips he was taking to Washington, D.C. This opened up a conversation about the lawsuit and his work history. I learned that he had worked at the Nevada test site where our Continental Nuclear Testing Program was located. The US government thought that Nevada was just right for testing nuclear weapons. They referred to the desert as a great place to, quote, dispose of used razor blades, unquote. It was 63 miles from the town of Las Vegas. At that time, it was just a town. Unfortunately, they even considered the impact on the closest downwinders and were assured that because of the Mormon propensity to be more passive in regards to government policies, there would be no interference with the testing program. They ultimately underestimated the Mormon community. It was this community that was the first to organize against the testing by suing for damages related to their exposures from fallout. My grandfather's lawsuit was one among many that ultimately led to the enactment of legislation as restitution to downwinders and workers. That's the program that we're working with now. While helping my grandfather with the suit, I came across the names of 240 of his fellow plaintiffs. The list included their age and cancer diagnosis. That was it. It was devastating to see the names of these victims in black and white. Reading name after name of relatively young men in the prime of their lives taken out by cancer changed the trajectory of my life from that moment on. I began to investigate the effects of our nuclear weapons industry on the workers and their families. I was shocked at the level of negligence by our government. The litigation by brave citizens spurred a national movement to compel the government to release documents, face its responsibilities, and compensate victims of the nuclear weapons program. When the energy employees legislation was passed, I was ultimately able to help my grandfather become covered for his cancer, and this led to me helping other workers, his colleagues, and such. Now it is my profession, and I am so blessed to have the opportunity to help workers and their families get the justice they deserve. I do this work in honor of my grandfather, who always stood up and spoke up for those in need. The Act, or the program that we work with, established a fund that provides compensation for some of the collateral damage caused by the US nuclear weapons program. Congress noted that the US government exposed nuclear workers to doses of radiation and other hazards that are presumed to have produced an increased incidence of cancer and respiratory diseases. The purpose of the Act was to establish a procedure to make partial restitution to the workers for the burden they have borne for the nation as a whole. Congress recognized that exposed workers were subjected to increased risk of injury and disease while serving the national security interests of the United States. Congress apologized on behalf of the nation to the workers and their families for the hardships they've endured by enacting the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act. The program that was enacted as a form of apology and restitution has become complicated and adversarial. I am now an authorized rep, or AR, for primarily Rocky Flats workers in their pursuit of compensation and medical benefits related to toxic exposures in the nuclear weapons industry. To qualify for benefits, workers must show that their exposures caused their illnesses. There's a process for determining if the workers were exposed to radiation at the site that caused a diagnosed cancer. Workers that have been determined to have a 50% or greater probability that their claimed cancer was caused by their exposures can qualify for compensation and medical benefits through the EEOI CPA, of which I am an authorized rep for individual workers and their families. There are two ways in which to establish a claim for radiogenic cancer, and that is through a dose reconstruction by NIOSH, or by working at the site for a time period that has been established as a special exposure cohort. And I'll explain these two ways, these two paths to being approved in the program for cancers. The dose reconstruction is arbitrary and based on assumptions by the CDC or NIOSH that time and again on all of the sites have been proven to be false. Our job is to present evidence to support that a dose reconstruction cannot be performed accurately. It is a team effort consisting of petitioners, former workers, and their families, advocates, and community members. We must convince the advisory board on radiation worker health that NIOSH does not have access to sufficient information to estimate dose. Imagine what it's like for laypersons to go up against DOE health physicists diligently defending their science. NIOSH uses former site health physicists to write site profiles for the entire nuclear weapons complex. The site profile for Rocky Flats has many unsupported assumptions about processing, monitoring, and source terms that form the basis of the report. This report is what NIOSH uses to do dose reconstructions, and many workers have reviewed the report and noted that there are many inaccuracies in describing the work at Rocky Flats. The site profile is used to inform the dose reconstructions. Thousands of workers have died waiting for a dose reconstruction that inevitably denies their claims. The workers waiting for dose reconstructions to be completed, and sometimes it can take a year and a half or 2 years, are asked about the details of their exposures, any incidents, quantities of radionuclides and types of radionuclides involved, and their proximity to the sources. So they're asked a lot of details about what they were exposed to when even at the time they weren't told what they were being exposed to. Workers do their best to characterize their exposures truthfully and accurately without benefit of records held by NIOSH. NIOSH is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and they run the program through another name, DECUS, with DOE health physicists. It is rare that after burdening these sick and dying workers that NIOSH will use any of the information gathered. A dose reconstruction by NIOSH to determine if there is a 50% likelihood that radiation exposure on site caused a cancer is statistically going to come back negatively. Most workers that apply through that process are denied. The second way to navigate through the process for approval of cancer under the Act is to be a member of a special exposure cohort, which I will refer to as an SEC. If a worker has cancer and worked at Rocky Flats during a time period that has been established as a special exposure cohort, a dose reconstruction is not required because NIOSH, during that process of designation of the SEC, admits that they do not have documentation or the ability to reconstruct doses. An SEC designation was made when the Steelworkers Union filed a petition claiming that NIOSH could not characterize the radiation environment of Rocky Flats, and therefore cannot reconstruct a worker's dose. The time period qualified for SEC designation in 2007 was from 1952 to 1966. NIOSH admitted that they could not reconstruct neutron exposure on site. So, to avoid the dose reconstruction process, workers that have worked for 1 year prior to 1966 and were diagnosed with a radiogenic cancer could qualify quite easily for the benefits in this program. Now, the program offers up to $400,000 in compensation and medical benefits for the covered condition. So it's very important to especially get your medical coverage for that condition. So in 2007, we got this SEC designation just for those few years at the beginning of the Rocky Flats work. In 2011, a new petition was submitted by a former worker and advocate requesting that NIOSH take another look at their ability to reconstruct dose at Rocky Flats. The Advisory Board on Radiation and Worker Health is mandated to review arguments and documentation from the petitioners, workers, family members, authorized representatives, and NIOSH to determine if they will recommend an SEC designation for a nuclear weapons site. And this happens for all of the sites across the nation. And many of them have been designated as special exposure cohorts. The petition asked for designation until shutdown in 2005. The process of getting this designation is unfair, burdensome, and arduous. Imagine what it's like for the laypersons to go head to head with health physicists that are working diligently to defend their science. At this point, in 2011, NIOSH had been insisting that they had sufficient information to reconstruct radiation dose at the site. Thousands of workers with cancer had been denied benefits based on their assertions. As an authorized representative, I am in the unique position to have access to records not readily available. When a claimant signs up with us, I order all current and historical medical records along with the Rocky Flats file. I do extensive interviews with workers, and sometimes I am fortunate enough to get access to private archives. I love when that happens. It is the workers and their willingness to share their experiences that has armed the petitioners with the documentation needed to prove their case. I am eternally grateful to all the workers that are willing to share their stories to help us get through the lies that surround Rocky Flats. They've been very brave. If you're from a site that's still active, I find that the workers, it's a lot more difficult to get information from those workers. The Rocky Flats workers have just been so generous. I'm very grateful to them. One of these workers is the passionately curious historian of the Critical Mass Lab in Building 886 at the site. This lab directed 1,700 criticality experiments from 1963 to 1987. There were issues with handling the equipment and fuel well into 2000. Plutonium processing ended in 1989, but there was a lot going on after that date that NIOSH and other authorities like to discount. When Dr. Rothy, the lead scientist of the Critical Mass Lab, learned that NIOSH claimed to be able to reconstruct dose at the site, he stepped up to the plate with documentation. You see, Dr. Rothy is meticulous, and he created an archive of the Critical Mass Lab, documentation along with a history of the lab and site with photos at the behest of Los Alamos National Lab. Now, Dr. Rothy believed that this documentation was going to be made public, especially for scholars and researchers. He expected an open access to his life's work. This was not the intention of LANL, Los Alamos National Lab. After Los Alamos took possession of the documentation, it disappeared down the DOE rabbit hole. The good news is that I have a very detailed index of the archive and a copy of the 500-page history that he authored. For the petition, we submitted interview transcripts and other documentation to NIOSH. The public comments and documents submitted on behalf of the petition can be found by Googling CDC NIOSH Rocky Flats SEC, and SEC stands for the Special Exposure Cohort. Some very interesting things said by Dr. Rothy are that there is no way that dose from the 9 reactor fuel tanks kept in the lab could be characterized. He said that the power level of experiments was not tracked and that a criticality could have unknowingly happened in portions of one of the tanks. The tanks were filled with highly enriched uranium and nitric acid. There were 4 reactors in the lab, and the fuel was used over and over again throughout the life of the lab from 1963 forward. When a criticality was intentionally initiated using high gamma sources such as cobalt-60 or californium, and all of those sources were held in the lab, the criticality would produce fission products resulting in irradiation of the fuel. So this highly enriched uranium wasn't just highly enriched uranium anymore and nitric acid. It was filled with fission products. The fuel was stored until 1996, when during D&D, it was sent back east to be processed. It took 3 years to move the highly radioactive liquid. NIOSH insisted that they could characterize the fission products by assuming a power level not agreed upon by the lead scientist. Authorities have answered community concerns about criticalities on site by stating that an, quote, accidental criticality never happened, and that the strontium-90 and cesium-137 found in the soils at Rocky Flats was from the Nevada test site fallout that we all were subjected to. These tanks that are being held at the Critical Mass Lab, they've had multiple spills over the life of the lab on site that consisted of highly enriched uranium and fission products and actinides, to include strontium-90 and cesium-137, neptunium, americium, and curium, to name just a few. There were too many incidents at the lab, and one that would have shut down the whole program for good was a large spill from these tanks that happened on the same day as the 1969 fire. The lead scientists knew that the fire would overshadow any concerns about the lab spill. The scientists also attested to the fact that whenever a very high gamma source was used to initiate a reaction, all of the alarms were switched off. That includes the criticality alarm. A criticality alarm would have necessitated a building-wide evacuation, and this would have happened on almost a weekly basis. In fact, every few days, Dr. Rothy said he was performing criticality experiments. He also said that sometimes the RCT would come in and, using a lead-lum on the tank, would say that we would have to, this is quoted from him, we would have to not use the room for a couple of days. And I believe that was to allow for the fission products that, the fast-acting fission products to die down a little bit before they would go back in. Dr. Rothy is my hero for stepping up to the plate and offering his vast experience and knowledge to help his fellow workers in the search for truth. Dr. Rothy did not stand to gain from his participation in the quest for an SEC designation, but he knows that he is on the right side of history. In the effort to establish SEC designation, workers testified to irregularities at the site. Many workers agreed to being interviewed and searched for documentation to support their assertions. Safety concerns from the steel workers were submitted, but all discounted by NIOSH. 5 workers from Dow signed sworn affidavits attesting to the fact that thorium metal was sent to Rocky Flats. Thorium dose cannot be reconstructed. NIOSH used one anonymous former employee interview to discount the statements. What they do is they'll hire a former worker, usually pretty high up at the site, and keep them on the DOE payroll after the site had shut down. And then they will use these workers as site experts, usually to refute some of the allegations by the community and by workers. And that's what happened in this case with the thorium. Hundreds of hours of research, FOIA requests, travel, and meetings finally resulted in good news. We got a portion of the designation passed. The SEC was approved by the HHS secretary, and NIOSH, after 13 years of reconstructing dose for workers that led to denials of their claims, had to concede and admit that they did not have worker or workplace monitoring information that sufficiently supported the reports for denial. NIOSH, the authority on Rocky Flats, had to admit that the science was faulty and the conclusions based on that science denied workers and their families the restitution that they deserved. In 2013, NIOSH recommended to the board SEC designation up until December 31st, 1983. NIOSH admits that in review of available monitoring data, as well as process and source term information for Rocky Flats, found that they lacked sufficient information to reconstruct the doses. And they were specific to exposures to uranium-233 and associated progeny, thorium and neptunium-237. They determined that they did not have workplace air monitoring and contamination surveys for uranium-233 and neptunium processing, and that the data is insufficient for dose reconstruction purposes. The cutoff date is December of 1983. Now, mind you, there was a hiring uptick during this time period, which may have informed the date, which denying the SEC qualification for any new employees hired in 1983. So to qualify, you have to have 250 days on site prior to the end of this 1983. So with that hiring update, that was uptick, that was the perfect date to choose. In regard to that cutoff date, NIOSH assumes that all production of neptunium and U-233 ended in 1983, but then had to acknowledge that there was a small neptunium production run in 1987, after the petitioner brought this to their attention. This is how they handled it. They wrote a report acknowledging that the neptunium processing and inventory was indicative of neptunium production, then proceeded to conclude that all production stopped in 1983. So they admitted that, yes, there was more production in 1987, but then when they wrote the report to designate the SEC, they just completely left out that date and changed it to 1983, or kept it at 1983. On appeal, the board refused to even acknowledge the fact that NIOSH had admitted that neptunium processing went beyond the cutoff date. In argument for later dates to be included in the designation, the petitioner brought to the attention of NIOSH a very large cobalt-60 source that was on site from 1979 to 1999, and then it was removed, supposedly. There is no way to reconstruct dose to cobalt-60. Workers nor the environment were ever monitored for it. NIOSH responded that there was a leak test performed in 1987 and that it revealed no leaks. The gamma cell was not addressed by NIOSH until the petitioner brought it up in appeal for the extended time period from 1984 to 2005. Now, NIOSH knows most everything that happened at Rocky Flats. They have access to records that we cannot get to. This is why the work of an authorized representative can lead to some amazing discoveries that can affect us all. After denial upon appeal of the extended time frame to include the shutdown period, I was going through documents given to me by a former worker and found a 2003 article in the Rocky Flats site paper. A large cobalt-60 and cesium-137 irradiator was being moved to a warehouse in Broomfield. This is the exact version of the source that had not been in service since the 70s and was moved in 1999, according to an anonymous site expert. Supposedly it had been moved off-site in 1999, but when I found this article, I realized that this may have been the same gamma cell and it had been moved to another building rather than moved off-site. That's just speculation. It could have just been another gamma cell, which NIOSH likely knew was there, but never informed us of. I have to wonder if perhaps this was the same irradiator and if it had not been moved to another building back in 1999. The calibration lab had the gamma cell irradiator, a high intensity X-ray, and 160 sources used to calibrate 3,000 monitoring instruments and TLDs every single year. The problem posed by keeping the equipment was the plan to demolish the building that they were housed in. So this is the article that I'm discussing. The building needed to be demolished. There were all of these sources, including this cobalt-60 and the cesium-137, very large, very, very high gamma emitters. I think it's up to 350 rad per hour. So there was a problem with how were they going to dispose of this so that they can demolish the building. The high dose sources pose this disposal problem and may have slowed down demolition. The solution was to transfer ownership to a new LLC formed by a site radiation safety manager. He took ownership and had the equipment moved to a Broomfield warehouse across from a residential neighborhood and adjacent to a ball field frequented by children. 17 years ago, Ball Aerospace moved into the now unmarked building. Your guess is as good as mine as to where this equipment ended up. Your guess is as good as mine as to where the equipment settled and how all of the 3,000 instruments per year meant to be calibrated for accuracy were transported to the warehouse from the site. Did they continue to calibrate instruments in the last 2 years during shutdown? Did the site inform the city of the presence of a new Department of Energy facility in their midst? These are the kinds of treasures that my clients give me access to. It looks like we're heading back to NIOSH for the next round. I appreciate so much all of the input from my clients and former workers at Rocky Flats. They've just been amazing at helping us discover many issues at Rocky Flats, and all of their courage in handing over their documents and testifying led to thousands of workers getting approved for medical benefits and compensation. And I just have to really express my gratitude to them. So thank you for allowing me to share my experiences as an authorized representative under the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Program Act. Thank you.